Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guest is Amy Williams, founder and CEO of Good Loop. Amy, what a pleasure to be talking with you on such a fascinating subject. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, it is indeed a pleasure. And why don't we start with two very big related topics? The first is why you founded Good Loop in the first place. And the second is the trends that you're noticing in the issues regarding purpose and cause marketing today. So first, Good Loop. You say that Good Loop is on a mission to make the internet a better place and make online advertising a bit more positive. Um,
Mm,
so why don't you just tell us a little bit about those goals and how you're doing it?
mm, sure. So I have always worked in advertising. I love this industry. I always have. I think it's a fascinating combination of using creativity to solve business problems. And my first ever job in advertising was working for Unilever. Um, on the agency side, making creative and TV ads for all sorts of Unilever brands. And I mean, it's cheesy to talk about Dove now, of course, it's the poster child of purpose. But back then in 2012, it really did feel like it was the forefront of our industry, and still to this day, I think it's easy to underestimate how boring soap is and how you become the biggest soap brand in the world, not by telling people how good your soap is, but by talking about real women and beauty standards and self-esteem. And these things matter to people in a way that soap never will, but you buy into the ideas that that brand communicates, and therefore you buy the soap, right? And I found that so fascinating and so inspiring, not just because it's a fantastic business mechanic, to sell soap, but also when you find concrete incentive structures for big corporations to do good, not relying on individuals getting up or on the right side of the bed in the morning or feeling warm and fuzzy, not relying on the goodwill of strangers, but relying on the black and white maths that you will sell more soap by doing good in the world, by helping women feel better about their bodies. You tap into the scale and the influence and the spend of these huge corporations. So that's what sort of drove me to start Good Loop, really, was if we can prove to the Unilevers and the P&Gs and the Nikes of the world that by doing good, they will sell more of their product, then they might do 1% more of it next year. And Nike doing 1% more good is a hell of a lot more good than I'll ever do in my lifetime.
That's a wonderful way to say it, because I think that it's one of the best ways I've ever heard explained of how advertising and marketing really elevates things. You're not
Mm,
just, yes, selling a product is fine. That's what business is. But to be able to feel that you are making people feel better about themselves and making better choices is pretty remarkable. Well,
mm,
that I can now understand the motivation, but tell me how you went about it. You
mm,
started it in the UK 8 years ago. And I'm assuming you had some clients, you had an idea. Maybe
mm.
describe exactly what you do.
Mm. Yeah, so I quit my job a little bit on a whim, actually, but sort of felt this. I felt like something wasn't right, and I knew that the only way to really have the courage to start something new was to just rip the band-aid off. So I quit my job at the advertising agency, and I spent some time studying entrepreneurship in Chile randomly. I don't know why I ended up in Chile, but why not? So I studied entrepreneurship. I did this fantastic residential course, and I learned how to code. I learned how to talk to investors. I learned how to write a pitch deck. It was this sort of grounding in all of the skills I needed to start thinking about building a business. And the thing I kept coming back to was, I've just come from this world where, these big brands say they want to do good. They say that purpose matters and that they want to connect on an emotional level with consumers. Fine. But then when you actually see ads online, when you actually come across one out in the wild, 9 times out of 10, it's not a pleasant experience. 9 times out of 10, it's popping up in front of your cat video, interrupting your article you're trying to read, auto playing with the sound on, and you can't find the X button. Like, we've all had these experiences, and that's why ad blocking is the biggest boycott in human history. 30% of the internet has just completely opted out of our industry. And that's a pretty serious stat, because these ads, they pay for the internet. They pay for the free information that keeps our democracy safe. And that's a whole nother podcast. But we're starting to see the effects of that funding getting compromised. So it felt important to me to figure out a way that advertising could be, in its experience, in the delivery, as positive and as purposeful as the brands that bought it. And that was sort of the mission of Good Loop. We said, right, there's a value exchange here. Rather than interrupt people, rather than force people to watch our ads, why don't we invite them to engage? And if they choose to give a little bit of their precious time and attention, then they can unlock a donation funded by that brand. And so that's the value exchange at the heart of Good Loop to this day, 8 years later, is if you watch this ad, and there's a countdown timer, so it's very clear how long you have to not press that tempting skip button. But if you give this advertiser your time, then you will unlock a donation funded by that brand. And so Good Loop brings that brand and that organization together. We've raised over $12 million to support all sorts of nonprofits around the world. And important for the advertisers, they get, on average, 2 times higher view-through rates, 4 times higher ad recall, and we build really important emotional connections with things like brand trust, brand affinity, and brand loyalty.
And the mere fact that people feel good that they're watching is donating to something. I mean, something that simple. So do you then marry the brands with the various nonprofits or charities, or I assume they have some of theirs that they choose? And in addition to that, would you describe kind of what it looks like? You've mentioned the countdown timer, but I believe it's in a frame, isn't it? Or could you just explain that as well?
Yeah, so in terms of the brands and how we work with them to find the right nonprofit partners, it's sort of 50-50. Sometimes they'll come to us and they've got these long-standing, established, brilliant partnerships. And often the problem there is no one knows about it. Cheerios were a founding member of No Kid Hungry. How many people know that? 25 years ago. The National Parks Foundation has been supported by Nature Valley for over 20 years. There are some really, really established partnerships between nonprofits and corporates that go deep into the values of the business and the values of the brand. And, our job in those cases is just amplify it, activate it, turn it from a logo on a CSR page to something that is front and center every time that consumer engages with that brand. In other cases, brands will come to us and say, we want to connect with a younger audience. Help us find some causes that resonate with Gen Z, or help us find causes that resonate with city dwellers, 45 plus with older kids. Like the thing with social impact and purpose in marketing is you just have to figure out what matters to your consumer and what is authentically something you as a brand can talk about and take a stand on. And so sometimes we're bringing that partnership to the table through our consultancy and expertise, and sometimes it's already there. In terms of the user experience and how you might see it out in the world, I'll give 2 examples. Firstly, let's say you're on the New York Times and you're about to watch a video. We will sit in the pre-roll before, and it'll be skippable pre-roll. So it will literally say, your free donation from Nike will unlock in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. And so that big countdown timer will tick down. It'll be right next to that tempting skip button. And then you'll unlock that donation and you'll see that cause. In the Nike example, most recently, we worked with them on their Megan Thee Stallion work and actually supported a charity that works with women's mental health and crisis lines for young women. So, super sort of aligned and beautifully authentic campaign. To give another example, we work on a listen to donate strategy across Spotify. So if you don't skip past the ad and listen till the end of the ad, then you unlock a donation in audio. So whatever channel, wherever in the world you want to talk to your consumer, we can inject that good value exchange to create good engagement. Make sense?
Is it just a quick question? Is it in all ads or is it in just a designated number of ads, or how does that work?
We work on either a kind of a campaign basis. So, a brand might say to us, right, this is a 100K campaign and we're going to run across these 5 sites or these key channels, and we'll then execute that. And Goodloop always donates 20% of the cost of every ad that we run. So it's super transparent and clear in terms of how much is getting donated to the nonprofit. Or in other cases, it's an always on strategy. So we'll just sit as a line item in their always on activation.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's amazing. Now, you mentioned a number of amazing results. Do you want to run through a few other specifics in terms of what it's done for brands or for what it's done for a nonprofit? Let's go there. And then I have just a couple of other questions, and then let's segue to some of the bigger issues regarding, the state of purpose right now.
Okay. So some of my favorite results are perhaps the less sexy ones because we've got a ton of results that say, this brand, we built brand love, we built brand trust, we built, these very valuable and important sort of brand affinity metrics. But of course we did that, that sort of comes with the territory. Where I'm really interested is how do we prove the concrete ROI of doing good? Like that's where it gets really, really powerful. So an example I think I would like to share is we work with ASICS, the sneaker, and they had an ad. It was their TVC. It's just an ad selling sneakers. It didn't have any social messaging or brand purpose, but we partnered them with a mental health charity. Because running and physical exercise is really good for your mental health. So there's a very authentic link there. But it was a link that didn't exist before. We brought that charity and brand together. And then we ran it on YouTube. And just by having that countdown mechanic and the unlock and the donation and that little dopamine hit where a consumer gets to do good for free, we found that the ad was actually watched. 56% more people actually watched the ad and didn't press that skip button. Now, where this gets cool is you're buying on a CPM. So you're buying on a cost per 1,000, which means that every person that doesn't skip reduces your cost per view. You already bought 1,000 eyeballs. And if all 1,000 skip, you've wasted your money. So the more and more people we can get to watch the ad, the lower the cost per view becomes. And we reduced their cost per view after the donation by 23%. So as I say, it's not some of those sort of nice top of funnel brand metrics, but it does really speak to, when applied correctly, using social impact and good can actually make your media buys more efficient and have a very, very clear impact on cost.
No, I think that's a great example, because I think that's what marketers definitely need to show,
Yeah.
and they haven't always had those kinds of metrics. But I also think that it's a very powerful statement of just what the right combinations, as you keep saying, the authentic combinations between a brand or a corporation and the organizations that they support. I mean, that I think is where the magic is. Yes, the magic is in the metrics,
Absolutely.
no question, but the magic is in making sure that it's very clear in a matter of seconds, just those interconnections, and so on. Well, let me, you make everything sound so positive and so sensible. What, you must have some challenges.
Oh man, so many.
Too many to
Yeah,
mention.
I have got a few more grey hairs since starting this business. It's been a very interesting journey. You know, the last 8 years, I've watched purpose swing in and out of fashion, and I've watched the pendulum come towards our way of thinking and then quite drastically reject it, you know, it's been sort of fascinating to see some of the language evolve as well, you know. So at the beginning, when I first started Good Loop, a lot of the talk was around cause marketing. Cause marketing was really about a brand working with a nonprofit to solve a problem. And my favorite example ever in this space is the Pampers activation, where they gave a vaccination with every pack purchased. And through a long running and, you know, really dedicated campaign of course marketing, they actually eradicated neonatal tetanus in over 25 countries. You know, that is a brand working with a nonprofit to have a seismic effect on humanity. So, you know, cause marketing is sort of probably the foundation upon which this all built. But increasingly, you started to see brands moving away from let's solve a problem, you know, let's solve neonatal tetanus, let's solve hunger, you know, that started to feel a bit tired, a bit charity, a bit unsexy. And so we started to see this sort of drive towards purpose being much more about standing for something rather than against something, standing for civil rights or standing for the environment or standing for mental health. And so increasingly brands were aligning themselves to these social issues and finding a purpose. And you know, that was really like a golden age, sort of the early 2010s of brands leaning in and having a very clear role for themselves in society. For some, it works well and has established, like Dove, you know, a legacy of impact. But for others, it became a token effort, quite hollow or shallow, and increasingly felt like it made a lot of advertising feel and look the same, you know, lots of plinky plonky piano music and worthy mission statements, and actually it lost some of the humor and some of the humanity. And I think Goodloop got a bit wrapped up in that, and we struggled to really find, like as you've said, that authenticity. And you know, fast forward to today, we've got so many new and complicated factors that a brand has to think about when it's deciding to do good. You know, the politicization of issues that once were social issues, you know, civic issues like diversity or climate change, that have become very heated and overly embroiled in culture wars that advertisers understandably don't want to get stuck in, you know. And there's scary consequences when you look at the things like Bud Light, or you know, the recent boycotts of Target. So you know, now I see a lot more hesitation and a lot more fear, but I also see those brands who have got that authenticity find their voice in a time when it's less common to sort of say you stand for something. The ones that truly do are the ones that stand out. And that's quite exciting to me. But you know, I'm not going to lie, it has made for a very complicated environment in which to run a company like Goodloop.
No, I can understand that, and you've actually touched on a lot of very important points. One is language, and I
Mm.
think that sometimes certain words, and this it's certainly true for the advertising business, but it's true for lots of businesses. You know, a word gets so overused that people really forget what its core definition is.
So true.
And it's almost as if there needs to be a refresh in terms of how one thinks about things, because it becomes let's tick the box rather than trying to figure out, you know, ways to make it come alive. You brought up another issue, which I think has been a problem. Well, two issues actually. One is we both use the word authenticity a lot, and maybe that's a word that needs to be re-explained. But you can't bolt on purpose
Yeah,
just to be able to make that work. And I think the brands I hate to use these cliches, but the brands that were established with some sense of purpose normally have an easier time of evolving that purpose. I mean, if you even look at the Dove brand, which you mentioned so beautifully, I mean, now some of the issues are really in terms of online bullying, or
such a
issues
good
that you
evolution
never
of
would
that.
have thought. And that's with, constantly evolving it. And I also think the other thing you said was about not only the sameness, but it doesn't have to be a weighty topic. Good advertising is good advertising, and generally good advertising has some sense of humanity, humor, a smile, something. And I think it doesn't mean that every time something is meant to be purposeful, it has to be dead serious. So
100%.
there's so much that you've said just then, but I understand that it's a difficult time, but I also think that there's a lot of brands who believe that if they do know their purpose, and I'm really talking about brand purpose as opposed to, let's call it, corporate purpose, in terms of corporations feeling a responsibility to do the right thing for their employees, to their stakeholders, to the communities, and all that. Not that a brand can't intermix with that, but there are some brands that just exist for the sheer entertainment of people's enjoyment. And it doesn't mean that they're always out saving the world.
Oh, totally.
So it's finding that place that actually works.
No,
Um,
I
yeah.
just to jump in on that, because I think that's a really good way of putting it. Purpose is best applied when it is applied in a within a sphere of influence that the business has for the consumer. So one of my all-time favorite examples is Tetley tea. Tea bags are never going to solve the world. Tea bags are never going to cure neonatal tetanus. But having a cup of tea, I'm English, as you can tell, so this is perhaps not going to translate. My love of tea runs deeply in my veins, but the act of having a cup of tea is a very, very powerful sort of symbol of connection in British culture. Do you fancy a cuppa is an expression of love deeper and more profound than any Hallmark movie in British culture. And so there's some really fantastic executions of Tetley's brand purpose around sharing a cup of tea to combat loneliness. Loneliness, especially in the elderly, is a very dangerous and deadly thing. It's also something that affects so many of us and our family members and our loved ones. So it's a purpose that matters, but it's also a purpose that is appropriately ambitious, and appropriate for the brand, and the product that the brand sells. And I just think that's such a fab example. Another one I wanted to bring up, when you were speaking, it reminded me of, is Advil. As a more American example, like the murder of George Floyd created a resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and it was really, really brilliant to see so many businesses think about what their voice in this is, what their role is, how they stand up for their stakeholders, whether that's consumers or employees, equally and in different ways. And I think there was a lot of pontification, and there were brands that weren't serious, and we're now seeing brands sort of backtrack and show that they, were only really doing it because of it being in the zeitgeist. But Advil are an example of the opposite of that, because they thought about, well, what's our sphere of influence? We're never going to be the brand that solves the crisis of racism in America, but we are a brand that deals with pain, and pain equity is an issue that has plagued the Black community for generations. Pain equity is the idea that if you are a person of color and you say you're in pain, you are less likely to be taken seriously by the medical community because of institutionalized bias. Pain equity means that when you go to the doctors, you have a higher mortality rate if you're a person of color. And this is something that Advil have lent into through content, through documentary series, through thoughtful brand work that has listened to and given voice to the community that experience it, whilst dealing with their own, historical role in that problem. And so, this again speaks to that idea of like, have purpose and take an issue into the heart of your brand, but think about, what's your sphere of influence and how can you do it in a way that's authentic.
No, I think you're right, and probably it's the second century of the American Heart Association that could be a wonderful partner to Advil in that regard. But no, I think that speaks to getting to the essence. I mean, I think what we're saying here is that getting purpose right means understanding almost the cultural and emotional essence that a product has in one's life and how it makes one's life meaningful. And whether that meaningfulness it could be as simple as saving people time or saving people money or providing better nutrition. I mean, there's so many things. And I think that it's odd that more brands don't do the work to say this. I hate the term, this is our swim lane, but this is we are about pain. We solve pain. Okay, so let's talk about how pain manifests, what the issues are around pain, or as one example, in the same way that Dove did, or really the same way that P&G did with Pampers. And I think that maybe it's interesting because I'm in the midst of doing another purpose study, this time with the ANA. We've done them annually for the last 12 years to really look at the evolution of from like purpose. And one of the questions I've been asking for ages is, should we have a new way to describe what purpose means? But we've seen this evolution from everything from what I call the purpose gap, where people's intentions don't live up to their actions, and again builds mistrust and inauthenticity. And I do think that in the examples you've given, sometimes partnering with something that is good is one way to express that. And I think that, yes, we're at another time, but it could turn out to be a more ethical time, or a time. I think people are just waiting and trying to play it safe. Nobody wants to deal with backlash, or maybe they're just trying to focus on the areas where, even if they did have some kind of backlash, that they know what they stand for. And I think that somewhere, you can't play it safe forever. No. So
I really like that.
Well,
but the thing is, so much of this is a distraction. So much of this sort of political, the sort of the cultural political moment of anti-woke culture wars. It's a distraction, because a lot of what successful brands have done in this area is tap into universal values. And values are so much run so much deeper in each of us. I'm not talking corporate values that sit on a poster in your in your lobby of your office or whatever. I'm not talking about those kinds of values. I'm talking about like my values, your values. Patriotism, kindness,
How you want to live your life,
thoughtfulness,
how you want
bravery. How you
to,
want to live your life.
right, how you want to define yourself as a human being, how you want to interact with other human beings. You know,
And how you want to define yourself as a human being, one of the ways you do that is the logos you wear. The logos I wear, the logos I buy, the logos I buy into are a way of defining myself as a human being and expressing that definition. Like this stuff is marketing 101, really. It's not new.
well, yes, but it's always new when there is change. And
Mm,
there's also people that may be newer to the business that don't have the history, that are
mm,
still discovering some of this, which is why case studies are so important. Um,
mm,
and I think that expressing the power of brand's conviction, provided that it marries up to everything that they stand for, it just has to be now seen as a positive thing, and it might have to be just done in smaller ways for a while.
mm,
So we'll see. I mean, there have been lots of conversations or things that I've read. Is this the death of purpose? And I would certainly disagree, but perhaps it might be the death. It perhaps it should be the death of shall we call superficial associations with what people think purpose is. I mean,
mm,
true purpose, as you've so eloquently expressed, runs very deep, and it's very much associated with values, and it's also, and often it's even the whole reason why a brand began or why it exists, even if the brand is 100 years old. As a matter of fact,
mhm.
probably the ones that lasted 100 years are those that really understood the essence of what they were about. So
So are
with
you, are you finding that in your survey? I'm so interested in this
I'm
research.
we're finding a number of things. And I think we're at a point, and I'll know more, I would say in the next several weeks. But because I think some of the best surveys are not only to offer some quick questions for people to, again, check the boxes, which is one way of getting an indication, but it's also talking to people that either care about this or are trying to discover it and want to learn about it. And I do think there are new ways to talk about this, and there's new issues to be of concern. For example, I was on a call yesterday, and one of the comments was that even though a lot of corporations are not necessarily advocating DEI policies, it doesn't mean that how they think of diversity in terms of their employees, and diversity
Mm,
means a lot of things. It means not only skin color, of course, it can mean gender, it can mean experience, it can be
mm,
age, it can be just diversity of thought, different people from different perspectives, and so on.
mm,
I think that maybe you don't have to tell people that they need to hit a quota to be
mm,
able to take the right actions. And that would be the positive side. The other thing that there seems to be, the sustainability side of things might be ramping up a little bit more. Not necessarily with a militancy about let's urgently save the planet, but even if you have a brand that is a snack food, and it's just meant to make you happy, maybe they still want to make sure a part of their ethos now has to be, is their packaging sustainable, or is there something that they can do to ensure that, they've cut down at least on whether it's plastics or whatever it is.
Hmm.
And I think that's become a little bit more ingrained. And maybe
That's good to
sometimes,
hear.
yeah, and maybe sometimes time, and maybe that's even more than ingrained. Maybe it's an essential step of doing any kind of a product now. You have to make sure
Mm,
that you're doing the right thing in that regard. So it's a topic that I want to make sure certainly stays alive, but it can only stay alive if people think it through. I mean, one of the things that I thought was one of the most positive that I've heard, there's a woman who I admire greatly. Her name is Ruth Bernstein. English, living in America, has an agency called Yard. And she talks not about purpose anymore, but about a term that she's done. And I'd love to do a book with her on this, called brand beacons. So I mean, the image just gives it to you right away.
yeah, that's powerful.
Those that, can, and it's not even the imagery of shining a light in the darkness. It's not that necessarily.